and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Derico, and you're watching the second session of our three-part series on U.S. Cuba relations, and today our guest is Professor David Fidler. Professor Fidler earned his Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School and currently serves as a senior fellow at Indiana University's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. He's also an adjunct senior fellow for cybersecurity with the Council on Foreign Relations and an associate fellow with the Center on Global Health Security at the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Now, he has also served as an international legal consultant with numerous domestic and global entities, including the World Bank and the U.S. Departments of Defense and State. With a specific focus in international law and an emphasis on security issues, he has researched and published pieces about post-Cold War U.S.-Cuba relations and the normalization of the two countries. So today, Professor Fidler will share his take on how the two nations' restored relations could affect the U.S.-Cuba economic and legal partnerships. Professor Fidler, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. So with restored U.S.-Cuba relations, it looks like a lot of different U.S. companies, from airlines to telecommunication corporations, they're really interested in going in and expanding their businesses in the island nation. What is your take on these expectations and efforts?
Well, I think the opening of the economic relations and diplomatic relations with Cuba is a long overdue measure. We have in the United States had a difficult problem with our domestic politics relating to Cuba and also the Cuban people. So I think from that point of view, the opening up does create some opportunities for the business community. What I think is important for U.S. businesses to understand is how they calibrate their expectations with regards to what the possibilities are in Cuba. In the press, there is a lot of talk about how much of a market there is going to be in these different sectors, but I think part of the business community's understanding of that in the United States has to be recalibrated for purposes of what things are actually like in Cuba.
Interesting. So as foreign investors and entrants, I'm sure U.S. companies are going to have to deal with different legal provisions as well as requirements to enter Cuba. So what are some that they should look forward to or prepare for?
Well, one of the things that businesses have to think about when they go into any market is what is the relationship in that society, in that economy, between the government and the private sector. Right, so this is just a standard thing you have to understand as you go into a market. What is the relationship there? What am I going to be dealing with the business? What's the maturity and the dynamism of the private sector? And that's where Cuba is very, very different. Right? So when companies go into Cuba, the government piece of that equation is going to be far more significant than they're used to in most markets, except perhaps maybe China. Right? But even I think in connection with comparing Cuba with China, at least in the government role in the market, in Cuba the government's role is even larger than it is. So the U.S. companies have to understand that they're going to be operating in a private sector which is really still controlled entirely by the government. So interacting with the government and learning how to deal with a government that still believes in many of the principles of communism, I think is going to be a major challenge.
Well, you've actually written extensively about Cuba's limited public access to its cyber network, as well as how it links kind of to the liberalizing of their economy. So I am curious, in the 21st century, is there really a correlation between open online network to the open economy that a country experiences?
Well, I think U.S. businesses think that there is, right? So we operate in a system where the internet operates openly, freely. It is absolutely integrated into everything that large, medium, and small size companies do. Entrepreneurs want to use that internet access in order to build new businesses. So for the United States, it's sort of all now totally intertwined with how businesses operate. It's not how the internet works in Cuba. So for me, the internet access and how the internet works is one of those examples of this need to calibrate expectations and working through a number of different challenges that companies don't have here or where they invest in other countries. The Cuban government has such tight control over the internet that U.S. companies are simply not going to be able to walk in and say, I want what I have in the United States, because that represents a threat to the Cuban government's sense of its own survival and existence. So there's going to be a very long, iterative dance between the private sector coming from the U.S. and Cuba. The flip side is I think the Cuban people want to have more access to a global internet so that they can begin to enjoy the benefits, not just the private sector benefits, but just in terms of having access to news, culture, music, other things from different parts of the world. But I think they also have some skepticism about the intentions and motivations of the United States government and U.S. companies. So I think also there's going to be this process of both sides sort of feeling out where the other is with regards to that. And that's why I think watching the way in which the Cuban internet develops is going to be sort of a hallmark or a bellwether of how the overall business relationship between the two countries develops.
And I think we danced around this next question, and I was wondering. So we are obviously witnessing the initial stages of normalized U.S. Cuba relations. So what kind of other economic opportunities and challenges besides this issue of kind of feeling each other out, right, per se, should we look forward to, or what can we expect? What kind of different opportunities and challenges?
Well, I think one of the things that U.S. companies, and I should also say that the opening of the Cuban relations with the United States is also to some extent a green light for other countries to do business in a larger way with Cuba. So I hope U.S. businesses understand that they just don't have a right of first refusal, if you will, for deals that the Cuban government or the Cuban private sector might want to engage in. So the U.S. businesses are going to have to compete. For example, in terms of developing out the Cuban internet, Chinese companies, Huawei, it's already there supplying equipment and technical expertise. So the market is going to be competitive in that sense, and that's going to create the need to understand not just the Cuban market, well, but also the way the Cuban people are thinking about the private sector. The Cuban people aren't used to this, and Cuba's been isolated, particularly from the United States, for so many years. So the Cuban society, the Cuban market has developed sort of its own way of life. It's not isolated in the way North Korea has been isolated. The Cuban people, I think, have a more sophisticated relationship with the world than North Korea does. But at the same time, Cuban society has developed its own dynamics. And the companies that understand that history and that culture and the desires and hopes of the Cuban people, I think, are going to be the businesses that succeed. If U.S. businesses go in thinking, well, this is just going to be like South Florida, right? This is just going to operate, or should operate in the way in which it operates in South Florida or in Miami, they are going to, I think, be at a competitive disadvantage to companies that take the time to understand and be sensitive to the history and the culture and the desires of the people in Cuba. Those desires, I think, are going to increasingly come into conflict with the Cuban government and its continued commitment to communist principles. So as the companies understand that societal aspect of doing business, that's going to reconnect to this issue of how do you deal with a Cuban government that sees these sorts of developments potentially as a risk.
So, if I understand this correctly, you think that in order to have a mutually beneficial partnership and collaboration with the U.S. and Cuba, U.S. entrants, first of all, need to realize what the expectations of the Cuban public as well as the Cuban government is looking for.
Yes, I'll give you an example. The Cuban people are very proud of their system of universal health care. And that's a system of healthcare that's delivered at the local level, at the community level. And this is something that in the United States we don't have, right? It's just a very different way of approaching healthcare. And so, for example, in the health sector, if a U.S. pharmaceutical company or a health services want to go in and build an American-style health system, this is not going to work, right? And that's not just a feature of ideology. I think it's a feature of something the Cuban people have been internalized, and they want to keep that aspect of their society and their culture. They don't want to see outside companies come in and destroying what they value. At the same time, I think the Cuban people want to have change, and they understand that that change is going to come in with political, diplomatic, and economic relations with the United States, and I think they welcome that. But I think they worry because of the history of the economic blockade of Cuba and the sanctions that the United States has put in place. It's not like they're sitting there believing that everything coming from the United States is going to be good. So they're going to be worried about this as well. It really connects back to a fundamental principle of doing business in any foreign country, right? Understand the culture, understand the people, understand the market. If you do that, you might gain a competitive advantage over some of your rivals. Here, I think because of the peculiar nature of the way in which Cuban culture, the Cuban economy, both the public sector and the private sector has developed, that puts a premium for U.S. businesses on investing time and expertise in understanding how that culture and society works.
Well, Professor Fidler, thank you so much for your time and giving us your insights today.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all for the second session of our three-part series on U.S. Cuba relations. Thank you for joining us. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please contact us at CIBER, that's CIBER, at indiana.edu.